It was a chilly Friday evening, and the warm glow of city lights reflected off the wet pavement outside an upscale restaurant tucked into a bustling downtown street. Inside, the hum of casual chatter filled the air. Clinking glasses and soft laughter blended seamlessly with the muted jazz playing in the background. It was the kind of place where the wealthy came to unwind after a long week, where the servers wore crisp uniforms, and the smell of expensive wine seemed to linger in every corner. Outside, under the soft drizzle, a figure lingered. His clothes were worn and patched in places, his jacket hanging loose over a body thinned by time and hardship. His eyes, though tired, held a certain calm, a quiet dignity that had carried him through tougher times than this. He adjusted the strap of his battered backpack and glanced through the large glass window, his gaze drifting over the bustling scene inside. He hesitated at the door, shifting his weight as though second-guessing himself. The restaurant's bright interior was a sharp contrast to the darkened street where he stood, and he looked as though he didn't quite belong. Yet, after a moment, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sudden chill of the outside air followed him in, briefly interrupting the cozy atmosphere. Heads turned briefly before quickly looking away, eyes darting to their companions or their plates. The man walked forward with a deliberate slowness, his boots making faint squeaks on the polished floor. Behind the counter, the hostess stiffened. She cast a quick glance at one of the waiters nearby, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do we really need this right now?" she whispered under her breath. The waiter, a man in his mid-30s with slicked back hair, responded with a low murmur. "We don't need trouble tonight." His tone was dismissive, his gaze lingering on the man's frayed jacket and mud-streaked boots. At the far end of the bar, a man sat quietly, almost blending into the background. His baseball cap cast a shadow over his face, and a hood covered most of his hair. He sipped from a glass of what looked like whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a quiet intensity. He hadn't missed the man's entrance, nor had he missed the reactions of the staff and patrons around him. The newcomer approached the hostess stand, his steps steady despite the weight of judgment pressing down on him from all sides. "Table for one, please," he said, his voice soft but clear. The hostess hesitated. Her practiced smile faltered for just a moment before she forced it back. She glanced over his shoulder at the half-empty dining room, then back at the man in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice polite but firm. "We're fully booked tonight." The man's brow furrowed slightly, and he looked past her, taking in the empty tables scattered across the room. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, his shoulders sinking just a fraction. "Right," he said after a pause. "Thanks anyway." As he turned to leave, the manager stepped out from behind the bar. His tailored suit and confident stride marked him as someone used to being in charge. His sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough authority to draw attention from the nearest tables. The hostess leaned in, lowering her voice. "He was asking for a table, but I told him we're full." The manager's gaze shifted to the man, lingering on his threadbare clothes and weathered face. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "We don't serve people like him here," he said bluntly, his words cutting through the quiet like a knife. "This isn't a soup kitchen." The man froze in place, his hand still on the door. His head turned slightly, as if to respond, but he thought better of it. With a quiet sigh, he pushed the door open and stepped back into the cold night. The staff exchanged glances, some smirking, others looking away awkwardly. A few patrons had overheard the exchange, but most quickly returned to their meals, unwilling to get involved. At the bar, the man in the hoodie set his glass down with deliberate care. He watched the door swing shut behind the veteran and then turned his attention back to the manager and hostess. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He adjusted his cap and leaned forward, catching the bartender's eye. "Another round," he said casually, sliding his empty glass across the counter. The bartender nodded, quickly pouring another drink. As he placed it in front of the man, he hesitated, lowering his voice. "You see that?" he asked, nodding toward the door. The man in the hoodie didn't respond immediately. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the way the light danced through it. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low and even. "I saw." The bartender opened his mouth as if to say more but thought better of it. He moved down the bar to tend to another customer, leaving the man to his thoughts. Outside, the veteran stood on the sidewalk, staring down at his boots. The rain had picked up slightly, and the cold was beginning to seep through his thin jacket. He adjusted his backpack again, the familiar weight a small comfort in an otherwise unkind moment. He didn't notice the figure stepping out of the restaurant a few moments later, walking with purpose toward him. The man outside shuffled a few steps down the sidewalk, his breath visible in the crisp night air. The weight of rejection pressed on him, heavier than his worn backpack. He stopped near the edge of the restaurant's warm light, momentarily gazing into the busy street where taxis rushed past, their headlights cutting through the mist. He wasn't sure where to go next. The shelter was a few blocks away, but he'd heard they were overcrowded tonight. He had hoped to find a quiet corner here, just for one meal, nothing fancy, just warm food on a cold evening. Behind him, the restaurant door opened again. The soft sound of it closing was drowned out by the traffic, but he caught the faint shuffle of approaching footsteps. "Excuse me," a low, steady voice called out. The man turned, surprised. He squinted in the dim light, taking in the figure approaching him. A man in a hoodie and baseball cap, hands casually tucked into his jacket pockets, walked toward him with an easy stride. "Everything okay?" the stranger asked, his tone calm and unhurried. The veteran hesitated, unsure how to respond. People didn't usually ask him questions like that. Most avoided him altogether, pretending not to see him. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low. "Just trying to figure out where to go." The stranger nodded, stopping a few steps away. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the city filling the gap between them. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back there," the man said, tilting his head toward the restaurant. The veteran glanced at the building, its warm glow almost mocking now. He shrugged. "It's fine. I'm used to it." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. "Used to it, huh? That's a tough way to live." "It is what it is," the veteran replied, his tone resigned. He adjusted his backpack again, the motion more a habit than a necessity. The stranger shifted his weight, studying the man before him. There was something in the veteran's demeanor, a quiet strength, a refusal to crumble despite everything. "Mind if I ask your name?" the man said. The veteran hesitated before answering. "James. James Carter." The stranger extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, James. I'm Tom." James hesitated again, then shook the offered hand. The grip was firm but not overpowering, and something about it felt genuine. "You were in the military, weren't you?" Tom asked, nodding toward the patches on James's jacket. James gave a small nod. "Yeah. Army. Did a few tours overseas." Tom's expression shifted, a flicker of respect crossing his face. "I figured. My old man was in the service too. Navy." James's posture relaxed slightly at that, and for the first time, he allowed himself a faint smile. "Is that right? Must have been proud of him." "Still am," Tom said, his voice soft. "He taught me a lot about honor, respect, and not judging people too quickly. Guess not everyone learned those lessons, huh?" James chuckled, though it was a bitter sound. "Not many do these days." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back toward the restaurant. "You hungry?" James shrugged, trying to hide his discomfort. "I'll figure something out." "I always do." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That's not what I asked." James blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, I am." "Good," Tom said, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Because I'm starving, and I hate eating alone." "Come on." James stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Tom gestured toward the restaurant. "Let's get something to eat." James shook his head, taking a step back. "I don't think they want me in there." Tom's grin widened. "Oh, I'm pretty sure they'll change their minds." Before James could protest further, Tom started walking back toward the restaurant, motioning for him to follow. "Wait," James called after him, his voice tinged with hesitation. "You don't have to do this." Tom stopped and turned, his gaze steady. "I know I don't. But sometimes you have to do the right thing, even when it's easier to look the other way." James hesitated for a moment longer before finally falling into step behind Tom. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere hadn't changed. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, refilling glasses and clearing plates, while the patrons laughed and chatted, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded moments earlier. The hostess was back at her station, her smile as polished as the counter she stood behind. When she saw Tom and James approaching, her smile faltered. "Sir, she began, but Tom raised a hand, cutting her off. "We'll need a table for two," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The hostess glanced nervously at the manager, who had been watching from across the room. The manager frowned, his lips pressing into a thin line as he strode toward them. "Mr. Brady," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Is everything all right?" Tom turned to face him fully, pulling back his hood and removing his cap. The recognition was instant. The manager's eyes widened, and his demeanor shifted from wary to obsequious in a heartbeat. "Of course," the manager stammered. "We'd be honored to have you here. Let me personally find you a table." Tom's expression didn't soften. He crossed his arms, his gaze sharp. "That's funny. A minute ago, you were all booked up." The manager's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Tom tilted his head slightly, waiting. "Well." The manager cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "There must have been a mistake. Please, follow me." Tom glanced back at James, who stood a few steps behind him, clearly uncomfortable. "Apologize first," Tom said, his voice calm but commanding. The manager blinked. "Excuse me." Tom gestured toward James. "Apologize." "To him." "Right now." The manager hesitated, his eyes flicking between Tom and James. Slowly, he turned to James, his forced smile returning. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, the words sounding stiff and rehearsed. "It was wrong of us to treat you that way." James shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. He gave a small nod. "Thanks." Tom watched the exchange with a critical eye before nodding. "That'll do. Now, let's get that table." The manager led them to a quiet corner of the restaurant, his usual confidence clearly shaken. Tom and James sat down, and within moments, a server appeared with menus and water. As James looked around, he noticed the stares from nearby tables. Whispers floated through the air, and he could feel the weight of their curiosity pressing down on him. "Don't mind them," Tom said, catching James's discomfort. "They'll get over it." James nodded, though his shoulders remained tense. He looked down at the menu, the prices making his stomach twist. "This is a lot." "Don't worry about it," Tom said, waving off his concern. "Order whatever you want." James hesitated, then finally allowed himself a small smile. For the first time that night, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: welcome. The veteran stepped into the restaurant, shaking off the cold that clung to his worn jacket. The patches on his sleeves were faded but unmistakable remnants of a life of service, now far behind him. His boots, scuffed and caked with dried mud, barely made a sound as he walked toward the hostess stand. The room fell quiet for a moment, just long enough for a few curious eyes to glance his way. Most quickly returned to their plates and conversations, but the air had shifted. The hum of casual chatter didn't quite cover the subtle unease that now lingered in the room. He stopped at the stand, his posture straight despite the weight of the world seemingly pressing down on his shoulders. His backpack hung heavily at his side, it seemed strained from years of use. "Table for one, please," he said. His voice was steady, almost calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of weariness in his tone. The hostess, a young woman no older than 25, blinked in surprise. She hadn't even noticed him come in. Her eyes darted to his boots, then to his unshaven face. She forced a polite smile, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her discomfort. Let me check," she said, glancing over her shoulder at the half-empty dining room. The tables were far from full. A few groups chatted over glasses of wine, and a couple sat near the window, sharing a quiet moment. But as her gaze shifted toward the back, she caught the eye of the manager. He stood near the bar, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The hostess hesitated before turning back to the veteran. Her voice was clipped when she spoke again. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone polite but firm. "We're fully booked tonight." The veteran's brow furrowed. He glanced past her, clearly noticing the empty tables. "Fully booked?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm afraid so," she replied, her eyes darting toward the manager again. Across the room, at the bar, a man in a hoodie and baseball cap swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He looked like just another patron unwinding after a long day, but his piercing eyes told a different story. Quietly, he observed the exchange, his expression calm but his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The veteran took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "I don't need anything fancy. Just a meal and a place to sit for a bit. I'll pay cash." The hostess hesitated again, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the reservation book. Before she could respond, the manager stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. His sharp suit and perfectly combed hair gave him an air of authority, but the smug smirk on his face quickly undercut any sense of professionalism. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough volume to turn a few heads. The hostess stiffened. "He was asking for a table," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. The manager's gaze shifted to the veteran, his eyes scanning him from head to toe. His smirk widened, and he let out a small, humorless laugh. "Sir," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I'm afraid you're in the wrong place. This is an upscale establishment. We don't cater to your kind." The veteran's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't argue. He stood there for a moment, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. "I just need a meal," he said quietly. The manager's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, dismissive expression. "Try the shelter down the street," he said bluntly. "I'm sure they can help you." A heavy silence fell over the room. A few patrons looked up, their curiosity piqued, but most quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved. The veteran nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "Right," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thanks anyway." He turned to leave, his steps heavier now. The door loomed ahead, its brass handle gleaming under the soft light. At the bar, the man in the hoodie set his glass down with deliberate care. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The sound was barely noticeable, but it carried an undeniable weight in the otherwise quiet room. The bartender, who had been polishing a glass nearby, glanced over. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice low. The man in the hoodie didn't respond immediately. He stood, adjusting his cap as his eyes followed the veteran's retreating figure. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Just fine." As the veteran reached for the door, it swung open. A couple walked in, laughing softly, their designer clothes and polished shoes a stark contrast to his worn appearance. They barely noticed him as they brushed past, their conversation continuing without pause. The veteran stepped aside, holding the door for them out of habit. They didn't thank him. He hesitated on the threshold, the cold night air rushing in to greet him. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, his hand gripping the door frame. Behind him, the man in the hoodie started walking toward the entrance. His steps were unhurried, but there was a quiet determination in his stride. The manager noticed him then, his eyes narrowing slightly. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the man in the hoodie met his gaze, and whatever words the manager had planned died in his throat. The hostess shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between the two men. The veteran finally stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. He stood on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the cool night air. He didn't know where to go. The shelter would be crowded, and he wasn't sure he had the energy to deal with the noise and chaos. Inside, the man in the hoodie reached the hostess stand. He pulled back his hood, revealing a face that was instantly recognizable. The bartender's eyes widened slightly, and a hushed murmur began to spread among the staff. The manager's confident demeanor faltered. His smirk vanished, replaced by a nervous smile. "Mr. Brady," he said quickly, his voice filled with forced warmth. "What a surprise. Is there something we can do for you?" Tom Brady didn't respond immediately. He glanced toward the door, where the veteran had just exited, then back at the manager. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There is." The manager straightened, his smile widening. "Of course. Anything you need." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. "I need you to explain something to me." The manager blinked, his smile faltering. "Explain." Tom gestured toward the door. "That man who just walked out, why didn't you serve him?" The manager hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape. "Well, you see, we—" "Save it," Tom said, cutting him off. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire room. "I want the truth." The manager swallowed hard, his face turning red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Tom crossed his arms, waiting. Outside, the veteran stood under the awning, the rain starting to fall again. He stared down at his boots, the cold seeping through the worn soles. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Every eye was on Tom Brady as he stood at the hostess stand, his presence impossible to ignore. And for the first time that night, the manager had nothing to say. The rain outside began to pick up, the sound of droplets tapping against the windows adding a rhythmic undercurrent to the charged silence inside the restaurant. The veteran hadn't moved far. He stood under the awning, staring at the darkened street ahead, unsure of where to go next. Inside, Tom Brady remained unmoving, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing within. His eyes stayed locked on the manager, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of the unspoken accusation. "Let me make this easy for you," Tom said, his voice quiet but razor sharp. "You judged him, didn't you?" The manager fidgeted, his confident veneer completely eroded. He glanced around, desperate for support, but the staff avoided his gaze. The hostess shifted awkwardly behind the stand, pretending to organize menus she had already straightened twice. It's not that," the manager stammered. "We have standards, Mr. Brady. Our clientele expects a certain atmosphere. Tom raised an eyebrow. Atmosphere? Yes, the manager continued, gaining a bit of false confidence. We can't just let anyone in. It's bad for business. The room felt like it had dropped several degrees. Tom tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Bad for business, he repeated, his tone slow and deliberate. Yes, the manager said, mistaking Tom's calmness for agreement. You understand, I'm sure. Image is everything. Tom didn't respond immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and set them on the hostess stand. Here's what I understand, he said, his voice steady. That man out there? He served this country. He probably put his life on the line so people like you could enjoy your image and atmosphere. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Tom held up a hand, silencing him. And you're telling me, Tom continued, his voice growing firmer, that a guy like that isn't good enough to sit in your half-empty restaurant and eat a meal he's willing to pay for? The manager's face turned pale. The murmurs among the staff and patrons grew louder, a mix of curiosity and quiet agreement. I didn't mean it like that, the manager said weakly. It's just. Just what? Tom interrupted. Just that he doesn't fit your idea of what a paying customer looks like. Outside, the veteran shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to block out the cold seeping into his bones. He didn't know what was happening inside the restaurant, but he could feel the stares of passers-by, some curious, others indifferent. Back inside, the tension was palpable. The bartender, who had been silently watching from behind the counter, finally spoke up. He's right, the bartender said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. That guy didn't deserve to be turned away. Several heads turned toward him, including the managers, who glared daggers at the sudden betrayal. This is none of your business, the manager snapped, his voice rising slightly. It is now, the bartender replied, crossing his arms. You're the one who made it everyone's business when you embarrassed that guy in front of the whole room. Tom gave the bartender a small nod of approval before turning back to the manager. Here's what's going to happen, Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're going to go outside, apologize to that man, and invite him back in. And if you don't, I will. The manager's jaw tightened. He looked like he was about to protest, but one glance at Tom's unyielding stare made him think twice. Fine, the manager muttered, his voice barely audible. He turned and made his way toward the door, his shoulders stiff with resentment. The veteran didn't notice him at first. He was too focused on the rain, which was now falling harder, soaking through the thin fabric of his jacket. Excuse me, the manager said reluctantly, his voice loud enough to compete with the rain. The veteran turned, surprise flickering across his face. I may have been out of line earlier, the manager said, the words clearly painful for him to utter. You're welcome to come back inside. The veteran stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the restaurant, then back at the manager. No, thanks, he said finally, his tone polite but firm. I don't want to eat somewhere I'm not wanted. The manager's face turned red, but before he could respond, the door opened behind him. Tom stepped out, his presence immediately commanding attention. Hey, Tom said, addressing the veteran directly. I saw what happened in there. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. The veteran shrugged, trying to brush it off. It's not the first time, he said quietly. Won't be the last. Well, it shouldn't happen at all, Tom replied. Come back in. Eat with me. The veteran hesitated, clearly torn. I don't want to cause any trouble, he said. You're not causing trouble, Tom said firmly. You're getting what you deserve, a hot meal and some respect. The veteran studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, he said. Tom held the door open, and the two men stepped back inside. The room fell silent as they entered, every eye turning toward them. Tom led the veteran to the bar, pulling out a stool for him. The bartender quickly brought over a menu, along with a glass of water and a warm smile. "Order whatever you want," Tom said, sliding the menu closer. "It's on me." The veteran hesitated, glancing at the prices, but Tom shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Just eat." As the veteran placed his order, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The staff, previously cold and distant, began moving with a newfound energy. The hostess, who had been so dismissive earlier, quietly approached the bartender, asking if she could help with anything. The patrons, too, seemed to reconsider their own behavior. A few whispered apologies to their companions, and one couple even approached the veteran to thank him for his service. At the bar, Tom and the veteran began to talk. Their conversation started casually, but as the minutes passed, it became clear that they had much in common: shared values, mutual respect, and a deep understanding of what it meant to face challenges head-on. The meal arrived quickly, the kitchen staff working with unusual efficiency. The veteran dug in, his initial hesitation melting away as the warmth of the food replaced the cold that had settled in his bones. Meanwhile, the manager lingered near the back of the room, his face a mixture of frustration and humiliation. He knew his actions had been exposed, not just to his staff but to his entire customer base. Tom caught his eye from across the room and gave him a pointed look, one that said more than words ever could. By the time the veteran finished his meal, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. What had started as a place of exclusion and judgment was now filled with a sense of community and shared humanity. As the veteran stood to leave, he turned to Tom, his expression one of gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. Tom smiled. "Thank you," he replied. "For everything you've done." The veteran nodded and walked out into the night, his step a little lighter than before. Tom turned back to the bar, his expression thoughtful. He had come here for a quiet evening, but what had unfolded was far more meaningful. And as the whispers of recognition spread through the room, one thing was clear: no one would forget this night anytime soon. The veteran paused, his hand still on the door handle, his body half turned toward the street. The rain outside was relentless now, pooling in the gutters and painting the pavement a slick black. He hesitated, not because of the weather but because of the commanding voice behind him. "Hold up," Tom repeated, stepping forward, his gaze fixed on the veteran. The calm authority in his tone was impossible to ignore. The room, once filled with murmurs and clinking glasses, fell eerily silent. Every eye turned to the man who had been sitting inconspicuously at the bar moments earlier. As he strode forward, pulling his hood back to reveal his unmistakable face, gasps rippled through the crowd. "Is that," someone whispered. "No way," another voice murmured. Tom Brady stood there, his piercing eyes scanning the room before settling on the manager. He wasn't angry, at least, not outwardly, but his calm demeanor carried the weight of disappointment that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. The veteran blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked at Tom, then at the staff, trying to piece together the significance of what was happening. The manager swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Tom's gaze. "Mr. Brady, we didn't realize." Tom tilted his head slightly, waiting. "Didn't realize what?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Didn't realize that a man who's probably fought more battles than you can imagine deserves a little respect? Or didn't realize that you were about to make the biggest mistake of your night?" The veteran stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. For the first time that evening, he saw something he hadn't expected: hope. The bartender, who had remained quiet during the earlier confrontation, took a step forward. "You turned him away," he said, his voice low but firm. "And for what? Because his jacket's worn? Because his boots are muddy? That's not what we're about. The bartender's words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the manager's authority. The manager's face turned crimson. He fumbled for words, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. It's just, we have standards. A certain atmosphere to maintain. Tom let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Atmosphere, he repeated. You mean a room full of people who'd rather look the other way than confront their own biases? A ripple of unease passed through the patrons. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Others nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. Tom turned to the veteran, his tone softening. What's your name? The veteran hesitated, his voice quiet but steady. James, he said. Well, James, Tom said, extending a hand, I'm Tom. And I'd be honored if you'd have a meal with me. James stared at the outstretched hand, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. I don't want to cause any trouble, he said finally, his voice almost apologetic. You're not causing trouble, Tom replied firmly. You're reminding us what it means to be human. James hesitated for another moment, then took Tom's hand. The room seemed to exhale collectively as the two men walked back to the bar. The bartender quickly cleared a space, sliding over a menu without hesitation. Anything you want, he said, his voice warm. It's on us tonight. James looked down at the menu, his fingers brushing the edges as if it might disappear. He glanced at Tom, who gave him an encouraging nod. Steak, James said finally, his voice still quiet but gaining strength. Medium rare. The bartender grinned. Coming right up. As James settled onto the bar stool, the room began to buzz again, though the energy was markedly different now. Where there had been tension and judgment, there was now curiosity and quiet reflection. Tom leaned against the bar, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the room. He caught the manager's gaze and held it for a moment before speaking. You know, he said, his tone conversational but laced with meaning, success isn't just about money or image. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. The manager's mouth opened, then closed again. He nodded stiffly, retreating to the back of the room. James took a sip of the water the bartender had placed in front of him, his hands steadying as the warmth of the room began to seep into his weary frame. So, Tom said, turning to James, tell me your story. James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the counter. Not much to tell, he said. Just a guy who served his time and came home to find the world had moved on without him. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. What branch? Army, James replied. 20 years. 2 tours overseas. The bartender, who had been quietly polishing glasses, stopped mid-motion. Thank you for your service, he said sincerely. James nodded, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. Appreciate that. The food arrived quickly, the steak cooked to perfection and accompanied by a generous helping of mashed potatoes and steamed vegetables. James stared at the plate for a moment, as if unsure it was real. Dig in, Tom said, gesturing to the food. James didn't need to be told twice. He picked up his fork and knife, the first bite bringing a quiet sigh of contentment. As he ate, the room began to shift again. Patrons who had initially looked away now watched with interest, their earlier judgments replaced by a growing respect. A few even approached the bar, offering quiet words of gratitude to James. You're a hero, one woman said softly, her eyes misty. James looked up, surprised. Just doing my job, he said simply. The woman shook her head. It's more than that. Thank you. The evening stretched on, the initial tension giving way to a sense of camaraderie and shared humanity. James began to relax, his posture less guarded, his words more open. Tom listened intently as James spoke of his time in the service, the challenges he faced upon returning home, and the simple dreams he still held onto. I just want to find a place where I belong, James said quietly, his gaze distant. You belong here, Tom said firmly. Don't ever forget that. By the time James finished his meal, the room felt transformed. What had started as a place of judgment and exclusion was now a space of understanding and connection. As James stood to leave, Tom reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. If you ever need anything, Tom said, handing it to him, call me. James stared at the card, then looked up at Tom, his eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tom smiled. No, James. Thank you. James tucked the card into the inner pocket of his jacket with care, as though it were made of gold. It wasn't just a card to him, it was a lifeline, a promise that someone in this world saw him as more than just a tired face in worn boots. Tom remained at the bar as James prepared to leave. Are you sure you don't want to stay a bit longer? He asked. James shook his head, his posture still tinged with the hesitation of a man used to moving on. I've taken enough of your time, he replied. Tom stood up, his tall frame towering over the bar. James, you haven't taken anything. You've reminded everyone in this room what's important. And I think some of us needed that tonight. As James nodded, the bartender leaned in. Before you go, let me pack you something for later, he said, hurrying to prepare a small to-go bag. James turned to Tom, his voice low. Why'd you step in? You don't even know me. Tom smiled, his expression thoughtful. My dad always said you can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them. And what I saw here tonight? That didn't sit right with me. James tilted his head, his expression softening. Your dad sounds like a good man. He was, Tom said, his voice quiet for a moment. And he taught me to never stay silent when I see something wrong. By now, the restaurant had transformed entirely. What had begun as a tense and unwelcoming atmosphere had turned into something warmer, more human. A few patrons who had initially averted their eyes now stepped forward, offering quiet words of thanks to James or nodding in Tom's direction. Excuse me, a young couple approached cautiously. The woman held out a hand to James. My brother's in the army too. Thank you for everything you've done. James hesitated, then shook her hand. Tell your brother to stay strong, he said, his voice steady but kind. The bartender returned with a neatly packed bag. Here you go, he said, sliding it across the counter. Just a little extra, in case you get hungry later. James accepted the bag, his gratitude evident in his expression. You didn't have to do this, he said. We wanted to, the bartender replied simply. As James made his way to the door, Tom walked beside him. Outside, the rain had eased into a gentle drizzle, the street lights casting golden pools on the wet pavement. Where are you headed? Tom asked, his hands in his pockets. Shelter down the street, James replied. It's not much, but it's warm, and they don't ask too many questions. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Well, if you need something better, give me a call. Seriously. James looked down at the card again, then back up at Tom. I'll think about it, he said, his tone a mix of gratitude and caution. Tom smiled. Fair enough. As James disappeared into the night, Tom turned back toward the restaurant. But before he could step inside, he noticed the manager standing just outside the door, his face a mix of embarrassment and unease. Mr. Brady, the manager began, his voice trembling slightly, I want to apologize for how I handled things earlier. Tom raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. And why's that? The manager hesitated, then sighed. Because I was wrong. I judged him without knowing anything about him. And I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're right. You were wrong. but what matters now is what you do next. The manager's face flushed, and he nodded. I'll make it right, he said. I promise. Good, Tom replied simply. Because people like James deserve better. And it's up to all of us to make sure they get it. Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The once muted chatter had returned, but it was now filled with a sense of connection and shared understanding. Patrons exchanged glances, some quietly discussing what had just unfolded. Tom returned to the bar, taking his seat and finishing the drink he'd left behind. The bartender, now noticeably more relaxed, leaned in. "Can I get you another?" he asked. Tom shook his head. "No, I'm good. But thanks for how you handled that." The bartender smiled. "It wasn't much. Just seemed like the right thing to do." "Sometimes," Tom said, his voice thoughtful, "the right thing is all it takes to change everything." The conversation drifted, the evening settling back into a rhythm. But the lessons of that night lingered, etched into the walls of the restaurant and the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Meanwhile, outside, James walked slowly down the street, the bag of food in one hand and the business card tucked safely into his jacket. For the first time in a long time, he felt more than just invisible. He felt seen. And as he reached the shelter's door, he paused for a moment, looking back at the faint glow of the restaurant behind him. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air fresh and cool. James stepped inside, a small but genuine smile on his face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, he carried with him the warmth of an unexpected kindness and the promise of something better. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Tom's commanding voice echoed across the room. He didn't move, his stance steady, his piercing eyes fixed on the manager. The veteran stood by the door, his worn boots rooted to the spot, uncertain if he should stay or go. Tom's words left no room for misunderstanding. "I don't care who he is or what he looks like. He's eating here tonight, and every time he chooses to come back, his meals are on me." The manager hesitated, his face a mix of embarrassment and fear. He glanced around the room, as though searching for an escape, but there was none. The silence pressed down like a weight, every set of eyes in the restaurant fixed on him. "Of course, Mr. Brady," the manager finally stammered, his voice trembling. "We'll take care of him. Please, come this way." Tom cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Not yet," he said firmly. "You need to make this right first." The room seemed to grow smaller, the air heavier. Every patron, every waiter, every busboy stood frozen, caught in the tension of the moment. The manager's face reddened further, his pride warring with the situation he had created. But he knew there was no way out. With a deep breath, he turned toward the veteran, his voice strained but audible. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out slowly. "It was wrong of us to judge you without knowing anything about you. I shouldn't have treated you that way." The veteran's expression softened slightly, though his stance remained cautious. He nodded once, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you." Tom took a step forward, breaking the heavy stillness of the room. He placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder, his tone shifting to something warmer. "Come on," he said. "Let's sit down and get you something good to eat." The veteran hesitated, glancing back toward the door as though debating whether to leave or stay. But something in Tom's voice, steady, genuine, convinced him. Slowly, he nodded, his steps tentative as he followed Tom toward the bar. The buzz of conversation resumed, though it was quieter, more subdued. Whispers spread quickly across the tables, fragments of astonishment and recognition filling the air. "That's Tom Brady. Did you see how he stood up for him? Unbelievable. I didn't expect that." At the bar, the veteran sat down, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he wasn't sure he truly belonged there. Tom slid onto the stool beside him, signaling to the bartender. "Whatever he wants, Tom said, his tone leaving no room for debate. The bartender nodded, offering the veteran a warm smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" The veteran hesitated, his eyes scanning the menu above the bar. "Just a burger and some water," he said, his voice almost apologetic. Tom chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not tonight. Get him the steak. Medium rare. And bring him a Coke to go with it." The veteran looked at Tom, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't have to do all this," he said quietly. "I know," Tom replied simply. "But I want to." As the bartender disappeared to place the order, Tom turned his attention fully to the veteran. "What's your name?" he asked. "James," the veteran replied after a moment. "Well, James," Tom said, leaning back slightly, "it's nice to meet you. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry for what happened earlier." James shrugged, though his eyes betrayed the weariness he carried. "I'm used to it," he said. "People see the jacket, the boots, and they make up their minds. Doesn't matter where I've been or what I've done. All they see is this." Tom's expression grew serious. "Well, they're wrong," he said. "And tonight, they learned that." James nodded, though he still seemed uncertain. "Why'd you step in?" he asked after a moment. "You could have just let it go." Tom's eyes softened, his tone thoughtful. "Because it wasn't right," he said simply. "And if you don't stand up when you see something wrong, what's the point of any of it?" James looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the bar. "You make it sound simple," he said quietly. "It should be," Tom replied. As their food arrived, the tension in the room began to dissipate entirely. The sight of James eating alongside Tom, a man so many admired, seemed to shift the atmosphere, replacing judgment with curiosity and quiet respect. Patrons who had initially ignored or dismissed James now glanced in his direction, their expressions thoughtful, some even apologetic. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, who's that man with Mr. Brady?" he whispered. The mother leaned in, her voice low. "I think he's a veteran, sweetheart. Someone who served our country." The boy's eyes widened. "Like Grandpa?" "Yes," the mother replied softly. "Just like Grandpa." As James finished his meal, the bartender returned with a small slip of paper. "No check for you tonight," he said with a smile. James looked at Tom, who simply nodded. "Told you. It's on me." For the first time that evening, James smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that softened the lines of his weathered face. "Thank you," he said quietly. Tom waved it off. "Just pay it forward when you can." The night wound down, the restaurant slowly emptying as the hours passed. But the events of the evening left a lasting impression, not just on James and Tom, but on everyone who had witnessed it. As James stood to leave, Tom handed him a card. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call me. And I mean that." James took the card, his fingers brushing against the embossed letters. He didn't say much, just nodded, his gratitude clear in his expression. And as he walked out into the cool night air, his steps lighter than they'd been in years, James carried with him not just the memory of a meal, but the reassurance that there were still people in the world who cared. As James stepped into the cool night air, the crisp breeze brushed against his face, but he no longer felt the cold the way he had earlier. There was a warmth in his chest now, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling of being seen, of being valued. Inside the restaurant, Tom wasn't done. His gaze swept the room, falling on the staff and the patrons who had watched everything unfold. He didn't raise his voice, but the gravity of his words was unmistakable. "Let tonight be a lesson," Tom said, addressing the room. "This isn't just about James. It's about all of us. How we treat people, especially those we don't know, says more about who we are than it ever will about them." The staff shuffled uncomfortably, a few nodding in agreement. Some of the patrons clapped hesitantly, a ripple of approval spreading as more joined in. Back at the bar, a woman who had been quietly observing the events approached Tom. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in business attire, her expression a mix of admiration and guilt. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "thank you for what you did tonight. I think a lot of us," she gestured vaguely to the other patrons, "needed to see that." Tom smiled faintly. "It's not about being seen," he said. "It's about doing what's right." The woman nodded, her cheeks reddening slightly. "Still, it takes courage to stand up like that. Most people wouldn't." "Maybe," Tom replied, "but if no one stands up, then nothing changes. And we all lose something when that happens." Her gaze shifted toward the door James had exited through. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Tom's expression softened. "I think tonight reminded him that not everyone's given up on him. That's a start." Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, James stood still for a moment, staring at the small card Tom had handed him. The embossed name seemed almost unreal. Tom Brady. It wasn't the name itself that struck him, he'd recognized Tom long before the rest of the room had. What lingered in his mind was the gesture, the sincerity behind it. It wasn't just a card, it was a bridge back to a world James thought he'd lost. He tucked the card into the inner pocket of his jacket, patting it lightly as though to reassure himself it was real. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than despair. Inside, Tom settled his tab at the bar, leaving a generous tip. He turned to the manager, who still seemed flustered but relieved that the tension had eased. "You've got a good place here," Tom said, his tone measured. "But remember, what makes a restaurant great isn't just the food or the decor. It's how you make people feel when they walk through that door." The manager nodded quickly, his face pale. "Absolutely, Mr. Brady. We'll do better." "Good," Tom said, slipping his hoodie back on. "Because I'll be back. And I'll be watching." As Tom left the restaurant, the whispers followed him out. People talked in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed, the impact of a single act of kindness amplified by the weight of Tom's fame. But for Tom, it wasn't about the attention. It was about the principle. He stepped out into the night, scanning the street for James. He spotted him a few yards away, standing under the glow of a street lamp, staring into the distance. "Hey, James," Tom called out, his voice breaking the quiet. James turned, his expression shifting to one of surprise. "You coming after me again?" Tom grinned. "Just wanted to make sure you're okay. Got somewhere to stay tonight?" James hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, there's a shelter a few blocks down. They know me there." Tom frowned slightly. "That's good, but it's not enough. You deserve better." He paused, his mind clearly working. "How about this? Give me a week. I'll set something up. A proper place for you to stay, somewhere safe and clean. You can call me if you need anything before then." James blinked, his weathered face struggling to hide his emotions. "Why would you do all this for me?" Tom shrugged, his smile warm but unassuming. "Because I can. And because someone should." As James walked away into the night, his steps steadier than before, Tom stood for a moment, watching him go. A quiet determination settled in his features. This wasn't over. The next morning, social media exploded. Patrons from the restaurant had taken photos and videos of the night's events, sharing the story of how Tom Brady stood up for a homeless veteran. "Goat on and off the field," one caption read, paired with a snapshot of Tom standing protectively beside James. The story went viral within hours, sparking conversations about kindness, respect, and the way society treats its most vulnerable. Tom wasn't one for social media theatrics, but he knew the power of a platform. That afternoon, He posted a simple message. It's not about being famous. It's about doing the right thing. Let's be better to each other. Hashtag kindness matters. The post garnered millions of likes, comments, and shares, inspiring others to share their own stories of standing up for what was right. But for Tom, the real victory wasn't in the likes or the comments. It was in the quiet impact his actions had made on James, on the restaurant staff, and on everyone who had witnessed the moment firsthand. By the end of the week, Tom had fulfilled his promise. Through his connections, he arranged housing for James and even helped him secure a job at a local community center. When James walked into his new apartment, a modest but clean space with a small kitchen and a soft bed, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And as he placed Tom's card on the counter, a quiet smile spread across his face. For the first time in years, James felt like he had a future again. As James took his seat across from Tom, he glanced nervously around the restaurant. The same eyes that had avoided or judged him earlier were now filled with curiosity and, for some, regret. It was a strange feeling suddenly being the center of attention in a room that had dismissed him just moments ago. Tom, however, acted as though none of that mattered. He waved over a waiter, his easy smile disarming. "Bring us 2 of your best meals," he said. "And don't hold back on dessert." The waiter, a young man with a slightly awkward gait, nodded quickly. His earlier indifference was replaced by a visible eagerness to make things right. "Of course, Mr. Brady. Right away." As the waiter scurried off, James leaned closer to Tom, his voice low. "You didn't have to do all this, you know. I'm used to people looking the other way." Tom shook his head. "That's exactly why I had to." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "You shouldn't have to fight for basic respect. Nobody should." Across the room, the manager sat hunched over at the bar, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with a pen. He had tried to retreat into his office after apologizing to James, but something kept him rooted in the public eye. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps it was the unspoken understanding that what had happened tonight couldn't be swept under the rug. One of the waitresses approached him cautiously. "You okay, Mr. Carlson?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes tired. "No," he admitted. "I think I messed up big time." The waitress nodded slowly. "Yeah, you did. But maybe this is your chance to fix it." Carlson sighed heavily, his gaze drifting to where Tom and James sat. Tom was laughing at something James had said, his genuine amusement lighting up the room. James, for his part, looked more relaxed now, his shoulders no longer hunched as though bracing for another insult. When the food arrived, James stared at the plates in disbelief. It wasn't just a meal, it was a feast. Succulent steaks, roasted vegetables glistening with butter, and a side of garlic mashed potatoes that smelled heavenly. The waiter placed a warm basket of bread between them, along with 2 tall glasses of iced tea. James hesitated, his hands hovering over the utensils. This is too much," he murmured. Tom chuckled. "It's just dinner, James. You deserve it." As they ate, James began to open up. He talked about his time in the military, the friends he had lost, and the struggles he faced when he returned home. Tom listened intently, nodding and asking questions, never once interrupting. "Most people don't want to hear it," James said after a while, his voice heavy with emotion. "They don't know what to say, so they just ignore you." Tom set down his fork, his expression serious. "That's not okay. And it's not your fault. People need to do better to listen, to care." Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely. Patrons who had once ignored James now seemed inspired by Tom's actions. A few of them even approached the table, cautiously introducing themselves to James and thanking him for his service. One older couple offered to pay for his meal, but Tom waved them off with a smile. It's covered, he said. But thank you. The couple nodded, their faces warm with admiration. What you're doing here tonight, it's incredible, the woman said. It's just the right thing to do, Tom replied simply. By the end of the meal, James looked like a different man. His posture was straighter, his eyes brighter. As they finished their dessert's rich chocolate cake with vanilla ice cream, he turned to Tom. I don't know how to thank you, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Tom smiled. You don't have to. Just promise me one thing, when you're in a position to help someone else, do it. Pass it on. James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As they stood to leave, Tom gestured for the manager to come over. Carlson approached hesitantly, his face flushed with embarrassment. Yes, Mr. Brady, he asked, his voice subdued. I hope tonight taught you something, Tom said, his tone firm but not unkind. You've got a great restaurant here, but it's nothing without integrity. Treat every person who walks through that door with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. Carlson nodded quickly. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Tom tilted his head. Good. Because if it does, I won't be back. And trust me, word travels fast. Carlson swallowed hard, nodding again. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. Tom and James stood under the glow of the streetlights, the restaurant behind them bustling with a newfound energy. So, what's next for you? Tom asked. James shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. I don't know. But for the first time in a long time, I think I've got options. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. Here's my number. If you ever need anything at all, call me. James took the card, his hand trembling slightly. I will. Thank you, Tom. For everything. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, his smile warm. Take care of yourself, James. And remember, you're not invisible. Not to me, and not to anyone who matters. As James walked away into the night, his step steady and his head held high, Tom watched him go, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. The next day, news of the incident spread like wildfire. A patron had filmed part of the exchange and uploaded it to social media, where it quickly went viral. Headlines read, Tom Brady stands up for homeless veteran, teaches a restaurant a lesson in humanity. But for Tom, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the likes. It was in the quiet transformation he had witnessed, the shift in James, in the staff, and even in the patrons who had been there that night. He had reminded them and himself that one act of kindness could change everything. And as he laced up his running shoes that morning, ready to tackle another day, he carried that lesson with him. Because in the end, it wasn't about the fame or the accolades. It was about doing what was right. Always. Would you like further elaboration on the public's reaction or how James's life changes moving forward? The restaurant had long since quieted down. The once bustling dining room, filled with the sounds of cutlery on plates and the murmur of conversation, was now eerily calm. The staff had returned to their usual duties, but the atmosphere felt different, charged with a new understanding, a quiet shift that no one could ignore. As James had left, walking with newfound confidence and dignity, the room seemed to hold its breath, as though collectively recognizing something profound had just occurred. The moments that had unfolded were no longer simply part of the evening's routine, they had turned into something much more meaningful. A lesson. A turning point. Tom Brady, a man who could have spent the evening in the spotlight, had chosen instead to use his influence to help a stranger, someone who had been cast aside by others. In doing so, he had shown the room what true greatness looked like. There was a saying that sometimes, the most powerful moments are the quiet ones, the ones that don't require grand gestures or applause. And tonight, in the simple act of standing up for someone who had been wronged, Tom had proven that. The manager, Mr. Carlson, sat quietly at the bar, still grappling with the embarrassment of his earlier actions. But as he reflected on what had just happened, he began to understand something. The humiliation he felt wasn't just about being called out in front of others, it was about realizing that, in that one moment, he had made the mistake of seeing a person as less than they were. And worse, he had allowed that judgment to shape his actions. He had failed to see the humanity in someone who had earned it many times over. Now, as he watched the other staff members moving around the restaurant, he saw something new in their faces, an awareness, a shift in how they interacted with the world. They had learned a lesson, too. One that would stick with them for a long time. There was the young waiter, who had initially been dismissive of James when he first walked in. Now, he was helping another customer with an attentiveness that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about good service anymore, it was about making each person feel seen and valued. It was about dignity. And there was the hostess, who had turned away James with a smile that hadn't reached her eyes. Now, as she greeted the next group of customers, she did so with a warmth that seemed to come from a deeper place. It wasn't just about filling a seat anymore, it was about making someone feel welcome. Every staff member, in their own way, had been touched by what had happened that evening. They couldn't forget it, even if they wanted to. And for that, they would be forever changed. But the real lesson wasn't just for the restaurant staff. It was for everyone who had witnessed what had taken place. Whether in person or through the video that had gone viral, the story of Tom's act of kindness spread far and wide. News outlets picked up the story, and social media was filled with comments praising the quarterback for standing up for what was right. People admired his bravery, not because it was an easy thing to do, but because it wasn't. It wasn't easy to stand up to the powerful or to speak out when it meant disrupting the status quo. It wasn't easy to choose kindness when others were choosing indifference. But Tom had done it anyway, and the ripple effect of that decision was felt far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Across the country, people were talking about the importance of seeing each other for who we truly are, not just as strangers or labels, but as individuals with lives, struggles, and stories. They were reminded that sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought on a battlefield, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to stand up for what's right. When someone chooses to make a difference, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant that difference might seem at the time. For James, that evening was a turning point, too. He had entered the restaurant unsure of what to expect, carrying with him the weight of years spent fighting battles that no one else saw. The world had often turned its back on him, sometimes literally, as it had tonight. But Tom's intervention had changed everything. He had been seen. He had been heard. And in that moment, he felt valued in a way that had been absent for far too long. As he walked into the night, his heart light, his thoughts clearer, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the struggles he had endured. Maybe there were still opportunities for him to rise again, to find purpose, to share his story with others. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't invisible. But James knew, deep down, that the true change would come not from fame or fortune, but from small acts of kindness and understanding. From recognizing the humanity in others and treating them with the respect they deserved, regardless of what they wore or how they appeared. From standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, not because it would make the world notice, but because it was the right thing to do. Back in the restaurant, as the night came to a close, the staff began to gather. Their conversations were quieter than usual, but there was a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. They had all witnessed something powerful, something that reminded them why they were in this line of work to begin with. It wasn't just about serving food or earning a paycheck, it was about people. It was about treating each person with dignity and making sure they felt welcome. And as they cleaned up and prepared for the next day, each of them carried a piece of the lesson learned that night. The knowledge that the work they did mattered, that the way they treated others mattered, and that true greatness wasn't about fame or fortune, it was about how you made others feel. The lesson was simple, yet profound: greatness isn't measured by what you can take, but by what you can give. By how you make others feel seen, heard, and valued. By understanding that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves respect. As Tom Brady drove away that night, his thoughts were on the evening's events, but not in the way you might think. He wasn't thinking about the headlines or the praise that he had received. Instead, he was thinking about the impact his actions had made on James, the restaurant staff, and even the people who had witnessed it all. He had done something small, at least in the grand scheme of things, but to James, it had meant everything. And if that wasn't a reminder of the power of human kindness, then nothing was. Sometimes, the smallest gestures can have the largest impact. Sometimes, the most important battles aren't fought on a battlefield or a court, but in the moments when we choose to make a difference in the lives of others. And so, as Tom drove off into the night, he carried with him the quiet knowledge that, in that one moment, he had done more than just help a man in need. He had reminded everyone who was watching that humanity comes first. Always. Because in the end, it's not about what we achieve, but about how we make others feel.